Right now, across dozens of Iranian cities, the lights are simply not turning on. Not because of a single attack, not because of a single storm, but because Iran's entire national infrastructure, its power grid, its water system, and its fuel distribution network is buckling under a combination of pressures that have been building for years and have now collided all at once. Millions of ordinary Iranians are waking up to rolling blackouts that stretch for hours, taps that run dry without warning, and gas station lines that wrap around entire city blocks. This is not a temporary inconvenience. According to multiple energy analysts and internal Iranian government statements, this is a structural collapse that has been years in the making, and it may be the most serious internal crisis Iran's leadership has faced in decades. You need to understand exactly how a country that sits on some of the largest oil and natural gas reserves on the entire planet ended up here, unable to reliably keep the lights on in its own capital city. Because the answer to that question tells you almost everything you need to know about the true state of Iran's economy, its infrastructure, and the growing gap between what its government promises its citizens and what it can actually deliver, especially now, in the middle of the most intense period of external military and economic pressure the country has faced in years. Let's start with the basics, because the scale of this crisis only makes sense once you understand what's actually failing and why. Iran's electricity grid relies heavily on natural gas power plants, and Iran happens to sit on the second largest natural gas reserves in the world. On paper, this should make chronic blackouts almost impossible. In practice, years of underinvestment in aging power infrastructure, a rapidly growing domestic demand for electricity, and a natural gas distribution system stretched to its absolute limit during peak winter and summer months have combined to create a situation where the country's own gas reserves cannot be delivered to power plants fast enough to keep the grid stable. When that happens, authorities are left with only one option: deliberately cutting power to entire neighborhoods and industrial zones on a rotating schedule, simply to prevent the whole grid from collapsing entirely. Here is where things get really alarming. According to Iranian Energy Ministry officials themselves, who have made unusually candid public statements in recent months, the gap between electricity demand and what the grid can reliably supply has widened to a level not seen in years. Iranian president's own energy officials have publicly acknowledged that certain provinces are experiencing blackouts lasting multiple hours per day, a level of disruption that would have been unthinkable in Tehran's more developed districts just a few years ago. When a government that has spent years projecting an image of self-sufficient resilience starts publicly admitting to the scale of infrastructure failure, outside analysts take that as a signal that the underlying reality on the ground is almost certainly worse than what's being officially acknowledged. The pattern of these blackouts tells its own story. Rather than being spread evenly across the country, outages have reportedly hit industrial zones and lower-income residential districts hardest, while government buildings, military facilities, and more affluent neighborhoods in northern Tehran have often been spared the worst of the rationing schedule, according to accounts relayed by residents and independent Iranian journalists tracking the disparity. This uneven distribution has become its own quiet source of public anger, feeding into a broader perception that the burden of the country's infrastructure failures is falling disproportionately on ordinary citizens with the least political power to do anything about it, while those closest to the government continue largely unaffected. I want you to hear what this actually feels like from someone living through it. Accounts relayed by Iranian citizens to international journalists, speaking anonymously out of fear of government reprisal, describe a daily routine now built entirely around unpredictable blackouts. Families keeping candles and battery-powered lanterns by the door, shop owners losing entire days of refrigerated inventory when the power cuts hit without warning, and hospitals in some regions reportedly relying on backup generators for extended stretches simply to keep critical equipment running. One resident of a mid-sized Iranian city described checking a neighborhood social media group each morning just to find out whether the power would be on that day, a level of basic uncertainty about modern infrastructure that many outside observers find almost impossible to reconcile with Iran's vast energy reserves. So why is a country with this much natural gas unable to keep its own lights on? The answer lies in a tangle of structural problems that have been compounding for years. Decades of international sanctions have severely limited Iran's ability to import modern turbine technology and spare parts needed to maintain and upgrade its aging power plants, many of which are operating well past their intended lifespan with patched-together equipment. At the same time, heavily subsidized energy prices inside Iran have encouraged extraordinarily wasteful consumption patterns, with some of the highest per capita electricity and natural gas usage rates in the world, because the domestic price of energy is kept artificially low for political reasons, discouraging the kind of conservation that would ease pressure on the grid. Layer on top of that a construction boom of energy-intensive cryptocurrency mining operations, many operating outside official regulation and drawing enormous, unaccounted-for loads directly off the grid, and you have a system stretched from every possible direction at once. The cryptocurrency mining piece of this puzzle deserves particular attention because it captures so much of what's gone wrong in miniature. Iran's heavily subsidized electricity prices, among the cheapest in the world for ordinary consumers, created a powerful financial incentive for both licensed and unlicensed mining operations to set up shop, since the cost of the electricity needed to run rows of energy-hungry mining rigs was, for years, almost negligible compared to what the same equipment would cost to operate anywhere else on the planet. Iranian authorities have periodically cracked down on unlicensed mining operations, at times ordering security raids on warehouses discovered drawing enormous unauthorized loads directly off residential and industrial grid connections, but enforcement has remained inconsistent, and estimates of the total electricity being consumed by both legal and illegal mining operations, combined, have varied widely, with some energy analysts suggesting the true figure could account for a meaningful share of the exact shortfall now forcing blackouts on ordinary households. Aging infrastructure compounds every one of these pressures. Several of Iran's largest power plants were built decades ago using foreign turbine technology from companies that, because of sanctions, can no longer legally supply replacement parts or technical support. Iranian engineers have reportedly become highly skilled at improvising repairs and sourcing black market components to keep this equipment running well past any reasonable service life, a form of resourcefulness that has kept the lights on longer than many outside analysts once predicted, but at a cost. Plants running on jury-rigged, decades-old equipment operate at meaningfully lower efficiency and carry a significantly higher risk of unexpected failure, exactly the kind of unplanned outage that turns an already difficult scheduled rationing system into an unpredictable crisis for the households and businesses caught by a plant going offline without warning. This is where we need to widen the picture, because the power crisis does not exist in isolation. It is deeply intertwined with an equally severe water crisis that has been building across Iran for years, driven by a devastating combination of prolonged drought, mismanaged agricultural water use, and aging urban infrastructure. Major Iranian cities, including Tehran itself, have experienced reservoir levels dropping to fractions of their normal capacity in recent years, forcing authorities into the same kind of rationing playbook used for electricity: scheduled water cutoffs, pressure reductions, and, in the most severe cases, water being trucked into communities whose local supply has effectively run dry. Iranian officials have specifically warned in recent public statements that Tehran itself, a metropolitan area home to more than 15 million people, faces what they've described as a serious risk of water rationing on a scale the capital has never experienced in the modern era. When the mayor's office of a capital city begins publicly discussing the possibility of large-scale water rationing, that is not a minor administrative announcement. It's an acknowledgement that one of the most basic guarantees a modern government makes to its citizens, reliable access to clean water, can no longer be taken for granted in Iran's largest and most politically significant city. Tehran's specific water vulnerability comes down to geography as much as policy. The capital sits in a semi-arid basin, historically dependent on a network of mountain reservoirs fed by winter snowpack that has, according to Iranian meteorological officials, declined significantly over a series of unusually dry years in a row. Reservoirs that once provided a comfortable buffer heading into the dry summer months have reportedly dropped to levels low enough that authorities have had to draw down emergency reserves earlier in the season than in any previous year on record, according to officials at Tehran's water and wastewater company. Engineers studying the system have warned that even a return to more typical rainfall patterns in the coming years may not be enough to fully replenish reservoirs that have been drawn down this severely, meaning the current crisis may represent not a temporary dry spell, but a new, more precarious baseline that Tehran's water infrastructure will have to operate under for years to come. Beyond Tehran, other major Iranian cities face their own distinct versions of the same water emergency. Isfahan, a historically significant city whose famous river running through its center has, in recent years, run completely dry for extended stretches, a visible, almost symbolic marker of the broader water crisis that has become a recurring flashpoint for public protest among farmers and residents who depend on that same river system for agriculture. Khuzestan province in Iran's southwest has experienced some of the country's most severe water shortages combined with extreme summer heat, a combination that has repeatedly triggered protests over what residents describe as decades of water being diverted toward industrial projects in other provinces at the direct expense of the local population's basic access to drinking water. Now, let's bring fuel into this picture, because the third leg of this crisis is just as severe as the other two. Despite Iran holding some of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, ordinary citizens have faced repeated fuel shortages and long lines at gas stations in recent months, driven by a combination of aging refinery infrastructure, sanctions-driven maintenance backlogs, and surging domestic demand for subsidized fuel that Iran's own refining capacity increasingly struggles to meet. Images and videos circulating on social media, later verified by independent journalists, have shown gas station lines stretching for blocks in multiple cities, with some drivers reportedly waiting hours only to find stations running out of fuel before they reach the pump. This fuel shortage carries a particularly bitter irony that has not been lost on the Iranian public. A country whose entire modern political identity has been built partly around resource independence and resistance to Western pressure now finds its own citizens standing in gas lines reminiscent of the fuel crises that have periodically embarrassed far less oil-rich nations. Economic analysts studying Iran's energy sector have pointed out that this specific irony, oil abundance combined with fuel scarcity, is almost entirely a product of policy failure and underinvestment rather than any genuine physical shortage of the underlying resource, which makes the political sting of these gas lines even sharper for a government that has spent decades emphasizing its energy self-sufficiency. The refining bottleneck at the heart of this fuel crisis has its own specific technical story. Iran's refineries, several of them decades old, were originally built and equipped with foreign technology now largely inaccessible because of sanctions, leaving domestic engineers to manage increasingly complex maintenance schedules with limited access to modern replacement parts or upgraded processing technology. Even when crude oil supply itself is not the constraint, the actual physical capacity to refine that crude into usable gasoline and diesel has become the bottleneck, a distinction that matters enormously for understanding why a country awash in oil can still run short on fuel at the pump. Iranian officials have periodically announced plans for major refinery modernization projects, but the same sanctions, restricting access to advanced turbine parts for the power sector, apply with similar force to specialized refining equipment, slowing these upgrade efforts considerably. Smuggling adds yet another layer of strain to the fuel picture. Because Iran's domestic fuel prices are kept artificially low through heavy government subsidies, a persistent black market has developed around smuggling subsidized Iranian fuel across borders into neighboring countries where it can be resold at a significant profit given the price gap with international market rates. Iranian border security forces have periodically reported seizing large quantities of smuggled fuel and dismantling smuggling networks. But officials have acknowledged that this illicit outflow represents a meaningful drain on domestic supply precisely at moments when ordinary citizens are already struggling to find fuel at their local gas station, adding yet another layer of public frustration to an already difficult situation. Let's talk about how this triple crisis, power, water, and fuel, is actually experienced by ordinary Iranians, navigating all three simultaneously. Small business owners have described impossible daily calculations. Refrigerated goods spoiling during unscheduled blackouts, water pressure too low to properly clean equipment during business hours, and delivery trucks stuck in gas station lines instead of making their scheduled runs. Hospital administrators in several regions have reportedly had to activate backup generator protocols for extended periods, running expensive diesel-powered systems continuously simply to keep dialysis machines, incubators, and surgical equipment functioning reliably, a stopgap measure that itself depends on a fuel supply chain currently under enormous strain. For families with young children or elderly relatives dependent on medical equipment at home, unpredictable power cuts are not simply an inconvenience. They represent a genuine ongoing safety risk that has reportedly driven a noticeable increase in emergency room visits related to medical equipment failures during blackout periods. Iran's manufacturing and industrial sector has absorbed some of the heaviest direct economic damage from this crisis. Factory owners across multiple provinces have reported being forced to halt production lines entirely during scheduled power cuts, a disruption that ripples through the country's already fragile economy in the form of lost wages for hourly workers, missed export deadlines, and damaged equipment when production lines are shut down abruptly rather than through a controlled process. Steel and cement producers, industries that are especially energy intensive and sensitive to sudden power interruptions, have publicly complained through industry associations about the cumulative cost of these disruptions, with some estimates from Iranian economic analysts suggesting the industrial sector alone has absorbed losses reaching into the billions of dollars over the course of the crisis. For a country already managing a currency in freefall and reimposed international sanctions, this additional drag on industrial output compounds an economic squeeze that was already severe before the infrastructure crisis reached its current intensity. Universities and schools have not been spared either. Reports from Iranian students and educators describe classes being interrupted mid-lesson by scheduled outages, online coursework becoming unreliable in regions where internet infrastructure depends on the same strained power grid, and, in some of the more severely affected provinces, school administrators shifting to reduced hours entirely during the worst stretches of rationing to avoid holding classes in unlit, unheated, or uncooled buildings depending on the season. For a generation of young Iranians already navigating a difficult economic outlook and limited opportunities, the disruption to even basic schooling adds another layer to what many Iranian commentators, writing under pseudonyms to avoid government scrutiny, have described as a broader sense of infrastructure and institutional decline settling over daily life. This is exactly the environment into which the recent military and economic pressure on Iran has landed, and the timing matters enormously. Following the strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure earlier this year, and the reimposition of sweeping international sanctions after European powers triggered the snapback mechanism built into the original nuclear agreement, Iran's already strained economy has been pushed even further past its breaking point. Sanctions specifically targeting Iran's energy sector have made it significantly harder for the country to import the specialized equipment, spare parts, and technical expertise needed to repair aging power plants, water treatment facilities, and fuel refineries, turning what was already a serious infrastructure crisis into something approaching a full-blown emergency. Mark Dubowitz, a sanctions policy expert who has spent years studying the economic pressure campaign against Iran at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, has previously explained exactly how this kind of infrastructure squeeze is designed to work as a form of economic and political pressure. According to his analysis, modern sanctions regimes increasingly target the specific technical inputs, turbine parts, refinery components, water treatment chemicals that a country cannot easily produce domestically or source from alternative suppliers without significant delay and cost. The theory behind this approach is that visible infrastructure failures, blackouts citizens experience directly in their own homes, create sustained internal political pressure on a government in a way that more abstract financial sanctions sometimes fail to achieve. Whether or not that strategy is working as intended is a genuinely contested question, and it's worth examining both sides carefully. Critics of this approach have long argued that sanctions targeting basic infrastructure like power grids and water systems primarily harm ordinary civilians who have no real influence over their government's nuclear policy, while doing relatively little to change the calculations of the senior leadership actually making those decisions. Proponents counter that sustained internal economic pressure has historically been one of the few tools that has ever brought Iran's leadership back to the negotiating table, pointing to the lead-up to the original 2015 nuclear agreement as evidence that economic pain, however difficult to justify morally, can produce genuine diplomatic movement when applied consistently over time. Inside Iran, this infrastructure crisis has already begun generating visible public frustration, and in some cases, actual unrest. Protests over water shortages have periodically flared up in provinces with the most severe drought conditions in recent years, sometimes turning confrontational when security forces have been deployed to disperse crowds angry over what they see as decades of agricultural mismanagement and political favoritism in how scarce water resources have been allocated. Fuel price adjustments, even relatively modest ones, have historically been one of the most reliable triggers for nationwide protest in Iran. A legacy of a set of demonstrations years ago that began over gasoline price increases and rapidly expanded into broader anti-government protests, met with a harsh security crackdown. That earlier fuel protest, which spread to cities across the country within days and was met with one of the most severe security crackdowns in the Islamic Republic's history, remains a defining reference point for how Iranian officials think about the political risk embedded in energy policy today. Analysts studying Iran's domestic security posture note that internet restrictions and communications monitoring around Iranian cities tend to tighten noticeably during periods of infrastructure-related public frustration, a pattern widely interpreted as a preemptive measure by authorities determined not to let localized anger over blackouts or fuel shortages coordinate into the kind of rapidly spreading nationwide protest movement seen previously. That same historical memory is precisely why, according to political analysts tracking internal Iranian decision-making, the government has been so reluctant to address these shortages through visible policy changes like price adjustments, opting instead for the less politically volatile, if practically inadequate, path of rolling blackouts and quiet rationing. Iranian officials, keenly aware of this history, have reportedly been extremely cautious about how they manage the current crisis politically, preferring rolling blackouts and quiet rationing measures over any policy change, like raising subsidized fuel or electricity prices, that could be interpreted by the public as the government making an active choice rather than simply managing an unavoidable technical problem. That political caution itself reveals something important about how fragile Iran's leadership perceives its own domestic position to be right now, layering genuine anxiety about public unrest on top of the external military and diplomatic pressure it's simultaneously managing in the Gulf and around its nuclear program. Regional neighbors are watching this internal crisis with their own set of calculations. Gulf states, some of which have complicated but functional trade relationships with Iran, despite the broader tension, have reportedly monitored the infrastructure crisis closely as a potential indicator of Iranian regime stability, factoring it into their own long-term strategic planning around the broader standoff. Iraq, which shares an extensive border and significant economic ties with Iran, including cross-border electricity and natural gas arrangements that have themselves been strained by Iran's domestic shortages, has felt some of the most direct spillover effects, as Iran has periodically reduced gas exports used to power Iraqi electricity plants precisely when its own domestic shortages have been most severe, creating a kind of contagion effect where Iran's internal crisis directly worsens power reliability in a neighboring country as well. Iraqi officials have reportedly raised this exact issue in direct talks with Tehran on multiple occasions, seeking guarantees around minimum gas delivery volumes that Iran has struggled to consistently honor given its own domestic pressures. For ordinary Iraqis in Baghdad and other cities dependent on this cross-border energy supply, Iran's internal infrastructure crisis is not an abstract foreign news story. It translates directly into their own experience of blackouts, adding a layer of regional interdependence to a crisis that might otherwise be understood as a purely domestic Iranian problem. Analysts tracking this dynamic have pointed out that it gives Iraq, and by extension the wider region, a direct stake in how Iran manages its own internal energy crisis, since instability or further deterioration inside Iran carries the potential to ripple outward into the electricity supply of an already fragile neighboring state. Turkey, which also maintains energy trade relationships with Iran, has reportedly used Iran's current vulnerability to negotiate more favorable terms on existing agreements, a reminder that even a country's own domestic infrastructure crisis can become another point of regional leverage in the broader web of Middle Eastern energy diplomacy. Analysts studying these regional energy relationships note that Iran's declining ability to reliably export gas to its neighbors, even as it struggles to power its own cities, is itself a quiet but significant marker of just how far its energy infrastructure has deteriorated relative to where it stood only a decade ago. Let's step back and look at what this crisis actually reveals about the broader Iranian state right now, a nation holding some of the largest oil and natural gas reserves on Earth, unable to reliably light its own capital city. A government publicly acknowledging water rationing risks in a metropolitan area of more than 15 million people. Citizens standing in gas station lines for hours in a country whose entire political identity has been built around resource self-sufficiency. Hospitals running on backup generators, small businesses losing inventory to unscheduled blackouts. And all of this unfolding at precisely the moment Iran is also managing military strikes on its nuclear infrastructure, a massive foreign naval buildup in the Strait of Hormuz, newly reimposed international sanctions, and reportedly, a brand new hidden nuclear facility under construction deep in a mountain ridge. This is not a coincidence of timing. It's the direct compounding result of decades of underinvestment, sanctions-driven technical isolation, and a political system reluctant to make the kind of difficult subsidy and pricing reforms that might ease the pressure on its own infrastructure, all colliding at the exact moment external military and diplomatic pressure has reached one of its highest points in years. Whatever the eventual outcome of the standoff over Iran's nuclear program, the country's ability to actually manage that standoff, diplomatically, militarily, or through continued defiance, depends enormously on the resilience of its own internal economy and infrastructure. And right now, according to virtually every metric available, from blackout durations to reservoir levels to fuel line lengths, that internal foundation is showing genuine visible cracks that millions of ordinary Iranians are living through every single day, largely disconnected from the headlines about carriers and bunkers and satellite photographs that dominate coverage of this crisis internationally. There is a deeper question underneath all of this that regional analysts have started asking more openly in recent weeks. How much longer can a government sustain intense external military and diplomatic confrontation while its own domestic infrastructure is visibly failing at the same time? Historically, regimes under this kind of dual pressure, external threat combined with internal service collapse, have faced a genuine strategic dilemma over where to direct scarce remaining resources toward continued defiance and military posturing, or toward the basic domestic repairs that might ease public anger and reduce the risk of the kind of nationwide unrest that has toppled governments elsewhere in the region in years past. Whichever path Iran's leadership ultimately chooses, the millions of citizens currently living through blackouts, water rationing, and gas lines are the ones absorbing the immediate cost of that choice, regardless of how the broader geopolitical standoff eventually resolves. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening inside Iran right now, beyond the military headlines, make sure to like this video and drop your take in the comments. It genuinely helps this analysis reach more people trying to understand the full picture of this crisis. We'll keep tracking every new development as it unfolds.